the best kind of travel is introspection in motion.
In motion. I can't remember whether I ever said that. I must have done, but I can't help you.
It's Among the Russians, 1983.
Oh God, I'm surprised I ever said that.
Does it make you cringe a little bit to hear your own words said back at you?
Well, particularly with that, when I was so focused on what was out there and so unusual for me. I'd never been in Russia before, and I was so fascinated and rather hypnotized by what I was looking at, that to imagine that it mattered what I was thinking about in my head is surprising to me. Yeah, cringing a bit.
Is that a sort of theme you've tried to move away from throughout your career writing? More an observation of where you are and less of an introspection?
It's just how it happens, you know. I never kind of planned that sort of thing, you know, how much it should be telling about me, which is quite a sort of obsession with some travel writers. It's never been my inclination. I'd be more fascinated by what's out there and felt myself to be comparatively unimportant. But of course, people slightly miss the personal. I've been told in my books that there's too little of me in there, which I can't do much about now. But and often people remember the personal details of what you've written in a way that can be sort of negate some of the things that you thought were important.
I think that's because that becomes the most relatable part of the prose to an extent, because we are not there seeing what you're seeing. We're rather seeing it through your eyes, and therefore how you might feel in any particular moment becomes maybe what we remember and latch onto a bit more.
Yeah, I remember, you know, writing a book on China. I was sort of obsessed by what was happening in what had happened during the Cultural Revolution. And I felt the whole theme of the book was this about my understanding of the Cultural Revolution and how it changed during the book. Nobody ever seems to remark on that at all. People constantly remember is that I saved an owl in a market in Guangzhou in old Canton and eventually set it free out of a train window. And everybody remembers this episode, and nobody ever mentions the Cultural Revolution to me. So it does remind me of how important or telling the personal incident can be.
How do you make sense of that? That in the backdrop of this incredible story of China's Cultural Revolution, this very narrow, almost seemingly insignificant story of you saving an owl becomes what they remember?
Well, in some ways a little bit depressing, but it teaches me a lesson that what is really memorable is often not theory or ideas and so on, or even politics. It's some personal incident. And what you cherish is when, of course, you meet somebody whose personal life has been affected by something like the history of the Cultural Revolution, which is not hard to find in China, because almost everybody of a certain generation has been affected by it. So those are the sort of incidents that you cherish, the ones that speak for a society or a past.
As you're going through day after day, night after night, how much of the book are you actually starting to compile through your notes? Do you almost have a finished thing ready to go when you get home?
You do in your head, but the notes are very rough. They're sort of impressionistic, really, and they're very full, but they're not in coherent prose. You know, nobody could read them comfortably and think that they make sense. But they do contain a lot of detail, because often it's the detail of a description that makes it live, to my mind, rather than the generality of a scene or a conversation. It's sort of the particular texture of that rock, or how somebody's eyes met in the middle, or what particular expression they used while you were talking. And all that goes down in the notes. So they're very full, because I forget the detail. My memory is very average, and you remember general how a conversation went or what a landscape looked like, but you don't remember the detail.
Are you afraid of recalling conversations or details that you didn't accurately note down in your book as a feeling of dishonesty, or is that sort of a part of the poetic license you get as an author?
I usually find that the reader has to accept that it's very compacted. You know, you haven't recorded the whole conversation. Usually, I've written down something almost at once after the conversation's happened. You know, occasionally during a conversation, literally made notes in my pocket quietly about salient subjects so I won't forget them. So, of course, the conversations don't include every and every digression, but I usually feel the sort of essence of them is there. Of course, it comes through your own particular sensibility and what you thought was important. So they're not usually word for word conversations. They're just as near as I can get, because I don't take a tape recorder with me.
You've experienced this incredible history of Russia over your literary career, Soviet Union, even before that throughout the UK. I suppose you could see what was happening during the Cold War. And then during Perestroika, and now in the Amur River, you've returned in the last 5 years. How have your feelings about Russia evolved over time? Is this still a place really close to your heart, or have you seen this decline, which is sort of saddens you?
It's a difficult question, that, because when I first went in the Brezhnev period, people were very sort of blocked off from you in public spaces. You had to get into their kitchens, and then they unfolded and became almost incontinently emotional about everything and forgave you for being a Westerner if they had to, and so on. And that was a period where the contacts you made were very so precious. They were achieved, I suppose, under some kind of difficulty that didn't happen later, when you could meet with anybody and have a free conversations comparatively. I don't know that my feelings about the Russians have changed. They will always, to me, have been the ordinary Russians, very friendly, very companionable, often a little bit eccentric and rather hopeless, often very lovable, and that hasn't really changed. Cities have changed more than the countryside. And places like Moscow have become quite ugly, I think, in many ways. There's a sort of oppressive feeling about them. They're the new rich. They were never there before. They weren't in evidence, and so on. So the sort of outward appearance of things in cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, they have changed. But in general, the Russian people and Russian spirit, I've found, has been pretty much
Consistent.
pretty much there always for me.
That feeling of oppression that you just mentioned, you felt in the cities. I did notice in the Amur River, when you were in a very rural part of Russia, that you were making these observations of the sort of desperation that they feel. Very little work for people, a lot of really young people having a lot of kids, and then just pretty much sheer boredom, nothing to do all the time. And so they're sort of retreating into their phones and alcohol.
Yeah, I mean, that has always been a problem with Russians in the countryside in particular, and particularly in Siberia, where I've traveled a lot. You get over the boredom by drinking. And that had got worse since the end of the beginning of the perestroika, since the end of the period of the Soviet Union. And you've got now 2 decades of them being, or 3 decades now, of them being post Gorbachev, if you like, and supposedly things should be getting better. But in the countryside, particularly with the breakup of the collective farms and the state farms, you find an awful lot of people with no security. In those days, they had a secure job, they had secure income. The collective farms were responsible often for hospitals, creches, and so on. And so the breakup of that whole system threw people back on their own resources in a very tough way. And people really, it meant a decline in agriculture, actually. And however miserable life was, however low the income, however miserable the circumstances of their living, they knew it was there.
Right.
They had a lifeline. They weren't going to starve. Now it's much harder.
It's funny you say that, because it paints quite a even more depressing picture of China, because in the Amur River, you noted that on the Chinese side, they felt culturally sterile, where even despite this desperation that you've spoken about within Russia, you still said they retained a certain type of chaos, and I suppose a charm underneath all of that as well. Is that more of a criticism of just how culturally sterile China was?
Well, of course, I mean, I found the Russians, I mean, it's awful cliches to talk about people like this, but I have found the Russians more obviously lovable. You could feel affection for them, where I feel respect for the Chinese on their side of the river. The feeling was of the farming being more regulated and more intensive, the people being more actively busy. There was less feeling of purposelessness, I suppose. There was, in certain of the Russian larger cities along the Amur River, which is in, of course, East Siberia, there was a feeling that everything was getting worse. The Chinese, I think, wouldn't have said that.
No.
They would have. They were busy in a very practical way, making money, making life.
What was the evidence you witnessed with your own eyes of the Cultural Revolution? when you do write the book, I think it's called China After Mao in 1987.
China, the evidence was in almost everybody you met. In those days, which is now, I realize, almost, 30 years ago, almost everybody had been affected in some way by it, particularly the more educated. And you heard again and again people who had suffered in the Cultural Revolution. You heard their stories. And just as I was going, a sort of directive had gone out from the Chinese Communist Party that it was all right to speak to foreigners. Up to that point, it had been almost forbidden. And suddenly it became okay. And people were keen to tell me what had happened to them, which was almost always pretty appalling. And what was hard was to find people who had actually inflicted the suffering. Those who were suffering were very vocal about it. But there was this enormous population of Red Guards, for instance, and their those who had instigated some of these horrors, who were less likely to talk about. In terms of serendipity, I ran into during the zoo, as in the zoo in, I think, Beijing, and ran into a man who did start to admit to me what he'd done out of the blue, which was shocking. And it was almost as if he was talking about somebody else. He didn't recognize who he'd been at that time. He was by then middle-aged man, and he couldn't quite believe the nightmare in a way at that time. But everywhere, everybody had been affected.
What was he confessing to you?
He was confessing having killed a porter. The porter was reading a romantic novel, sitting in a gateway somewhere. He was with a gang of Red Guards, and they beat this guy to death. And he even mimicked how he had done it himself with a club. And seemed in a way sort of aghast at the whole thing. It was a sort of something from which he'd mentally dissociated himself from.
Given the way he dissociated himself from it, did you feel a need to, like a fear of this guy, sort of he's unhinged, I should go away? Or was there a part of you that sympathized with this impossible position that had moved the culture and him towards this position where he feels like reading a romantic novel is worthy of death?
Well, I think the second, I began to feel that the sort of group mentality at that time, the indoctrination of very young people and the adulation of this supposedly strong and infallible leader in Mao Zedong, one could begin to understand it when the whole nation had been caught up in this nightmare about themselves. I certainly didn't feel I should run away from him. I can't say he seemed quite normal, but he was fairly normal. It's horrible to think about it, but the situation, the country's situation, the political situation, the propaganda made it possible for very young people in particular to do these things, even to people they knew, to friends, to their teachers, classically.
How did you feel your reputation and certainty about a career as a travel writer? When did that become thrust upon you? Was it just given the immediate success of the first Damascus book? Or was there a point in your life where you realized, I'm starting to be invited to these events. I have, confidence in my next books being published and then sold?
Well, of course, the first book was very important because you don't know whether it's going to be published or not. And it was really a work of fascination and love. And I always felt that, I would go on travel writing, however successful or unsuccessful I was. Of course, I was very much encouraged by the reaction to that first book, which people hadn't written really about Damascus before. And I just settled in the city and lived there and felt that youthful enthusiasm, which you never quite feel again. No subsequent book quite gives you that sense of love of a place, really, of an experience. Damascus, and I went back there a few years ago at my peril. Hadn't changed. I got in there from the Lebanese mountains, and it wasn't like Aleppo, which has been virtually destroyed. It was a city in which all the buildings I knew were still intact. But that first book was seminal to my sense of, I guess, a certain kind of self-confidence. So there was a break, I guess. I wrote books to start with, which were about very small areas, Damascus, Lebanon, and Cyprus, which are both tiny. And then, for some reason, I started on a trajectory writing about huge countries like Russia and China, about which I could study all my life and still know little about.
Forgive me if I'm wrong here, but I feel like you've never done a book from North or South America or the African continent or Australia. Is there a reason why, I think in 17 nonfiction travel books you've written, why there is such a sort of particular fascination for the Middle East and Asia and Northern Europe rather than some of these other parts of the world? Did they just not call to you the same way?
I think the Middle East initially called me because I wanted somewhere it wasn't Europe, it wasn't familiar, and it hadn't been written about too much. And I guess I had a romantic feeling, in particular about Syria and the Middle East. It was peaceful in those days, and there were connections to it, to Europe, such as the ancient Greeks and Romans or the Crusades. I didn't feel it was absolutely alien in the way that Japan would have been. So I felt a certain confidence about going there with all sorts of romantic ideas in my head. And it was always Asia for me that fascinated me. And I think it was the ancient cultures that interested me so much initially. Even though I went to countries like China and Russia, which weren't so obviously full of the manifestations of those cultures in the way that, say, India or Iran are. So I was sort of drawn into it that way. And then, of course, you get an investment in it. You've done quite a lot of research, say, and you begin to feel that that's what you should be writing about because you know a certain amount. You know, when I started writing about Russia, of course, I tried to learn the language, and that's quite a big investment. I attempted to learn Mandarin. I became not at all good at either. But again, it was a great deal of time and went back to school to learn Mandarin. And you have all that investment in it. And then, you know, if you like to say, you're stuck writing about these places because that's what you know about. And to then go back, say, Africa and learn Swahili and try to understand that culture would be an enormous move, which I never made.
So it's a bit of the sunk cost fallacy. You feel like you've made all this investment so far, I have to stay the course.
That's right.
There are some nice, charming moments, at least in the Amur River, where you are conversing with Russians and you make the observation that, you know, my Russian was better than their English. So presumably you are getting around quite a lot purely in Russian, which creates a much more immersive experience and feel.
Yes, my Russian's been fine for ordinary getting around and stuff. What I get in trouble with is when a lot of Russians are speaking together, then I start to lose it. So almost all the conversations in my books have been one-on-one, because then you can settle down with somebody. If you don't understand somebody you can say, could you repeat that? Or do you mean this? Or do you mean that? And so you expedite a proper connection that way. So, I've managed.
Even though you've made this attempt, and even in the first answer, you responded as if, I wish I hadn't involved my own emotions or my own feelings or my own thoughts throughout this journey. I just wanted to be a pure reflection of what I'm seeing. Did you ever want to really lean into that side of the prose and tell almost a memoirish book about some experience you're going through, but this country is the backdrop of it? Like, was that an instinct that you always had to fight away? Or is it just naturally, I don't want to talk about myself?
It came naturally, really. I didn't want to talk about myself. What I was seeing, particularly in countries like Russia and China, is societies and cultures that are so important that you feel your own stuff is actually meaningless. Of course, it's not, because, you know, you're the prism through which this country has been seen. You can't pretend what you're doing is the pure Russia or the pure China. You just make the effort to do that. And I think it was just my natural instinct not to write too much about my own feelings or certainly not to treat it as a rite of passage for myself or anything of that kind. I never felt of it that way. I didn't look at it thinking, what is it going to do to me or for me, or what's it going to tell about me or anything of that sort. I was just fascinated by what was around you.
Because I'm just thinking that it is your experience as an Englishman in a foreign land that creates the juxtaposition which makes it relatable for the English-speaking reader somewhere else in the world to be experiencing it through.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And I think it may be one of the strengths of the travel book, in fact, that, you know, it is a first-person narrative, and the writer, the traveler, is up for judgment, just as those around him may be. They get a sense of who you are, what your sort of priorities are, what your sort of weaknesses are pretty quickly, I think, a reader, without your having to lay it on the line, really. That's what I've always felt, although I'm told that, my books can be a little bit too impersonal, and I should have laid myself on the line.
How do you feel when you hear that criticism?
I don't feel too bad. I feel much worse the other way. They said there's too much of you in your books and not enough of where you are. That would upset me.
So your first book, 1967, I believe it was published, Into Damascus.
Yeah.
And were there travel writers doing something similar to yourself that you drew inspiration from? Or did yourself and contemporaries like Paul Theroux and Bruce Chatwin, did you almost create a new niche of publishing within travel writing, in the English-speaking world at least?
I don't think so. It became very popular in England, of course, travel writing, particularly in Britain, although Paul Theroux was American. When I started in the mid-60s, it wasn't particularly popular. There were writers I admired, like Patrick Leigh Fermor and Fair Stark and others, but there wasn't that sort of popularity that came in the late 70s. People often say it was Paul Theroux's Great Railway Bazaar that started the feeling that travel writing was not just accessible and fun and interesting, but it was a sort of literary genre. Publishers began to latch onto it. There's Bruce Chatwin, Jonathan Rayburn, and I was lucky to be part of that 1980s generation, if you like, that were publishing at that time. And publishers then really took on travel writing in a big way. So I guess the early influences were Stark and Leigh Fermor for me. But there were those before. Then Jan Morris was another one. But there were a number of them. There were very good writers there. They just weren't so acknowledged as those that came later.
And have you observed that same travel writing niche since? We've gone through very introspective journeys, almost like a geopolitical travel sort of writing, extreme adventure travel sort of writing. In the narrative arc of your publishing history, how have you observed it?
Well, one saw the high point in the 80s, and then something happened in the 90s which made it less popular. And what it was, I think, in part, that publishers overpublished. They thought this is a good genre, we're selling it. And there were a great flood of them. Other things, Jonathan Rayburn, who was one of the 4 or 5 most popular ones. He confined himself to the States, which was okay, but made him less popular maybe back in Europe. I don't know. Bruce Chatwin, of course, died, which was a blow. And so it seemed to decline thereafter. And there was also a feeling, starting like so many things start in American universities, that this is a colonial enterprise. It's something that you shouldn't be doing, basically, as a single white man out there looking at poorer countries than your own. It's a sort of neo-colonial bit of hubris. And that had to be contended with in a way. I think that as far as a working travel writer is concerned, it's nonsense to suppose that everything's to do with power. It seemed to come from Foucault in a way. Everything's about power. You, as the privileged travel writer, talking to, Indian farmers or Chinese factory workers, you're the one that has the education, you're the one that has the knowledge because you're in their society in a way that they can't be in yours, and so on and so on. So it's thought of as a neo-colonial enterprise. But if you go down this path and imagine that all human relationships are, grounded in power in a way, who has the power, then all human contact becomes a sort of paranoia, and nobody would travel at all anywhere.
Yeah, exactly.
And nobody would go into a country that was in any way considered to be poorer than their own, and we'd then be deprived of a great tool of understanding, which travel writing can be. So that is continued, I would say, to this day, that it is less important. And travel writers are doing much more in the way of diversifying. They write novels, and the travel book itself can be a little bit more sort of different. It can be more ecological, maybe. It can be more closer to nature writing. It's become less, the pure travel book doesn't necessarily hold the field in the way that it did.
Yeah, the feeling that, if Colin's telling the story of this poor rural Chinese farmer, that should be the story of the rural Chinese farmers to tell, not Colin's. It kind of doesn't stand up on any merits at all, because you're not doing anything to inhibit him telling his own story. It's rather just a genuine exploration of the world for the people that are most curious. It's your choice to read it or not, after all.
Yeah. 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 And I said before, the reader can judge you as a first-person narrator.
As they will.
Just in a way, it's more, in that sense, it's more truthful, perhaps, than an academic article, say, which may appear to be, impersonal and therefore not have this mediating mind or sensibility that's there in a travel book, which is very obvious because of the way travel books have to work.
The way that you talk about the publishing success of the 80s, I think that same appetite that drove that publishing success, which was people really keen to understand, open up the door to this part of the world, which I've never been to and likely never will go to. I think that appetite has actually stayed constant over time. It's rather just the medium where they're finding those answers change. So I don't know if you've noticed, but in the last few years on YouTube, there's been a burgeoning field of just individuals with little cameras going around, walking through the rural parts of countries, talking to the locals, telling a bit of a narrative history arc about what happened in this place and what the context is for why we're there. And these are enormously successful videos, which does make me think like that appetite is constant. It's rather just where do we consume it? And therefore, how do the economics play out on the other end of it?
Yeah, no, I'm aware of that a little, perhaps not as much as you are. Because of my age, I'm less inclined to look at those sort of sites than a young person would be. But it certainly speaks for that thirst for experience and for sending it back and recording it. That is just great. And who knows, the death of the travel book has always been framed from time to time, ever since a century ago, people were saying it's dead, it's finished, the world's got too small and so on, but it hasn't. And probably these other genres or ways of recording travel will coexist along with the travel book, which of course is a more sort of considered, I suppose, way of imbibing that knowledge. If you're reading a book, it's not the same as looking at something on the screen. Not quite.
Not quite. How have you noticed the homogenization of cultures through globalization, especially in your most recent trip? That sets almost a 50-year gap between when you first ventured out and have ventured out again. Is this something you've noticed, or do you think it's overhyped?
Globalization in the sense
of homogenizing cultures, sort of lessening the sharp distinction between the uniqueness of traditions and behaviors and attitudes, most especially. Like if we're all consuming very similar types of culture through very similar types of apps, it does soften those edges which were once very distinct.
Well, I think you're right in using the word soften. It doesn't really alter them too fundamentally. One of the interests of travel now is to find how thin, in a way, the veneer of sort of westernization, say, in Asia really is, and how the actual deep roots of the culture are thriving underneath. Luckily for traveling, because after all, we travel to find difference, don't want to find ourselves at the end of the road. But it's an illusion, I think, to feel that the world is westernized, and we know how deep cultures are and how they will announce themselves in politics. You see how we hope to westernize or change different cultures, whether it's Russia and post-perestroika, or whether it's the Middle East, say, with various invasions and attempts to democratize, and things go back to how they've always been. Because what politicians, I think, particularly ignore is the underlying culture. You think you can manipulate a place politically by imposing a democracy or unseating a dictator, but things will go back to, unfortunately, how they've always been. Such things move very slowly, I think. So globalization, yes, but I don't think it's a serious inhibitor to traveling.
To continue that point a little bit, how underneath this rather thin veneer, the cultures are still very strong and very distinct. Have you noticed in your lifetime one culture change quite dramatically?
No, I can't think of one. You may be able to prompt me there, but I haven't. There was it would have to, because I think it's always slow when a culture changes. A political system might change. I suppose in the way you could say Eastern Europe changed after 1989, when the Soviet Union broke up. But I feel it's only a fairly, it's not a radical change. Central Asia is another one, the five great Islamic or sort of partially Islamic republics of the old Soviet Union, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, all the stans. You'd expect them to have changed and perhaps to have become Islamic, as was the fear. But they go back to feeling rather nostalgic about the old Soviet Union and being very recognizable as they were before. I can't think of a culture that has changed. Maybe you can. I can't.
If I were to have an opinion, it would be very uninformed. I haven't been to really any of the countries that you've been to. But I wonder, what about your own country, Colin? Not just England, but the broader United Kingdom. How have you observed the change in this country since your birth in 1932, I believe?
I'm probably the least apt person to ask this, since I've been too little in my own country. But of course, you come back and begin to see it with rather more a colder eye, an external eye. I don't know. I think the national characters, for better or worse, remained pretty much as I remember it. We could see developments, obviously, but nothing that is deeply surprising. It's an interesting question that I should think about more, my own country, but nothing surprises me terribly. I was depressed, I have to say, by Brexit, by the departure of Britain from the European Union. It surprised me that there was quite so much little England feeling, that feeling of specialness that so many countries have, including very much my own. I was surprised that that really kicked in, to the extent of imagining that we would be better without Europe, which we are basically such a fundamental and potentially important part.
It's so funny from the outside. It's one of the most perplexing self-inflicted wounds you could imagine. But I do remember many of my mates who live in London aren't necessarily conservative. They were swept up a little bit in the populist rhetoric. Like, fuck Europe. You know, we're our own country. We can make our own decisions. We don't need them. And I suppose it's a very powerful feeling if you can pull it off, which they did, obviously.
Yes, it is. I mean, as one sees everywhere, that nationalism, which it is, which we call patriotism, that nationalism is other people's, as patriotism is always our own. That feeling that in some way Brussels, you know, all the massive bureaucracy of Europe, they were inhibiting us here and stopping us doing that and this. Probably easier for a country that didn't see itself invaded or changed in the Second World War. Always felt in some way that we were separate and special, and other countries had succumbed or been conquered, or whatever had happened to them. Their borders had been transgressed in some way.
Yeah.
But ours not, because
you have a big
20-mile world.
Exactly.
That's what saved us in part. But that surprised me, I have to say, that there was still that sense of.
It's funny how you repurpose the word nationalism for patriotism. The Populist Party in Australia right now, we're in the throes of an election, is called, and I shit you not, Colin, it's called A Trumpet for Patriots. That's the name of the party.
Okay.
And you know, it is very perplexing, because here we are in Australia. We have not even a fraction of the sort of economic and all the rest problems that the United Kingdom or any other country that's falling for populism might have. Yet somehow there is enough of an appetite here to justify this party and the huge amounts of money being spent on it. It's quite weird.
It even has Trump in the slogan.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Yeah, unbelievable. So for this feeling of, here you are, you're constantly leaving the country to go, and whether for your own curiosity or as some means of escape and discovery, you're going to these other places. And I fear to quote you after the way we started it, but I'm going to do it anyway. The further one travels from home, the more clearly one sees what home really is. Not as a place, but a condition of the heart. And so I suppose underneath that, it's like a question of, can we ever really get away from where we came from? Even if you had set up roots somewhere in China, would you still be this guy from England after it all was said and done?
I don't think you can. No, I think people have an illusion that they've done so. And once or twice I've been in a country where I've met an expatriate, probably a British guy who's been a long time there, and says, you know, I'm one of these people, you know, I'm integrated. And you ask the people round about and they say, oh, that's a strange fellow. He's been here for a long time. He's not Not, he's a funny sort of British guy. And it's an illusion, I think, that you really lose, unless you go very young, that you lose the habits of your culture altogether. No, I don't think so.
Yeah, it's remarkable how deeply imprinted cultural norms and behaviors are, and how almost impossible they are to shed.
I find, I've wanted to, as a travel writer, I've wanted to be, as it were, sort of clear glass through which you could transmit what's around you, another world, but it's nonsense. The whole travel account you give is tinged with yourself, every sentence, really, even the style in which you've written, let alone the material. So I don't think you lose it.
And what about the role of religion in your life? Are you a religious person?
No, I was as a teenager, actually. I was quite fervently a Christian, which didn't augur well for later development. It doesn't help to be in the Middle East, where you begin to see Christianity in its homeland, in Jerusalem and Palestine and Israel, when you begin to see it as a historical phenomenon rather than an act of God. And many things militated against my remaining a Christian. I remained interested always in faith. It's always fascinated me, whether it's the Christian faith or Islam, or even the sort of coolness of China and how they respond, and the deep religiosity of many Russians. It's always fascinated me. I felt a sympathy for it, but I've never been able to share it.
How do you make sense of such deeply held faith all around the world of all different stripes when they all sort of lack the same necessary evidence to really feel something so deeply?
It's a good question. I think I find it easier to understand, say, Islam or Christianity than I do Hinduism or Taoism, or because I experienced it, and know, I suppose, a great many people who continue to be quite strongly Christian in their faith, and I can see the comfort of it, and I can see the hold that it has when you've been taught it since childhood, and that doesn't surprise me. It should, I think, because Hinduism and Buddhism surprise me more. But they're not really about belief so much, more about being. It's Buddhism in particular. It's if you like it, you don't specifically have to believe in, I believe in the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, and so on. It's more an experience than an act of faith, and literally, and that I'm a bit sympathetic to it, and I can see how it works, but I find it hard au fond to understand or to accept that people can believe in what is certainly, to me, in Christianity, quite irrational. It has to be a leap of faith. After all, as far as we know, virgins don't give birth to children, and people don't get resurrected from the dead. So it can't be actually a rational religion. It has to be something else, something fundamental. And as Christians would say, coming from a experience within a soul instinct, of what you would categorize it. I've recently in Egypt, looking at what is the longest religious tradition in the world, or was, which is the ancient Egyptian, and one finds for 3,000 years they believed in gods that have disappeared, a medley of different gods, which seem impossible and alien to us, just as perhaps ours will seem alien to people in many centuries to come. And the instincts of one can understand the instincts and how a society can almost compel belief.
Yeah.
But
given
I can't.
Given that, like you just note, the ancient Egyptians had this set of beliefs. All around the world, everyone has these different set of beliefs. What are you and I missing, Colin, that we ourselves cannot take the leap of faith that just causes the circuitous argument because it is inexplicable to both sides? What's stopping us from just accepting this leap of faith?
You mean what inside us is it that's preventing us from believing?
We're presented with the same evidence as everyone else. Why is it the case that we can't as well take that leap of faith and presumably find a little bit more meaning in our lives?
I don't know. One misses an awful lot. You miss an afterlife, for one thing. And it puts your own existence in a very different formula from that in which you believe that you will your life here is just a testing ground or an experience, which is only the porch, if you like, to something much longer and finer. I can't accept it. I don't know what it is that stops one believing. In my case, I'm afraid it seems to be pure rationality. What I say is common sense. And I suppose also that the Middle Eastern experience, or the whole experience, even of, say, the ancient Egyptian religion, which one could see as a death and resurrection cult in many ways, so that Christianity seems and Islam seem less extraordinary than they do if you learn about them back in the West in isolation from where they originated. So, I think it sounds rather self-regarding to say that it was with a sort of intellectual awakening that made me question the religion that I had received, and unable to continue with it.
You mentioned, well, it sort of takes away from you an afterlife. Are you thinking about mortality?
I should. I'm 85. No, the answer's not really. I think everybody of my age should be thinking about it to the extent of preparing for those who are left behind you, in terms of, what you do with your material belongings, who you leave behind, and in what can make things easier for them when you're gone. I don't expect to exist in any sense after my death. I think, as somebody said, being born is not a great advertisement for the afterlife. If we're born, then we die like other organisms, and that's all right with me. And I think there are things that, and everybody has things in their lives that they regret. But on the whole, I've been enormously fortunate in mine. I don't find myself thinking, because I think my mother, who lived to the age of 97, said you must always have a project. I mean, all your life you've got is something you should be doing, something you've set your mind on. And I think that's wise. One will probably die with a project unfulfilled, which would be unfortunate. But to have something rather than just waiting, which is perhaps what one thinks of as a typical condition of retirement, just waiting for it.
Yeah.
Would be making one think more about it. But there's no point to me in thinking very profoundly about it, because I come up with a blank in regard to my beliefs. And so I think about the next book I'm going to write, which may never happen. But
this might sound quite sappy, but does this land with you at all, that there is a sense of immortality, given you're talking about things you leave behind? You're leaving behind at least 20 books, and in 100 years, presumably, someone could pick up the Amur River, and what you said, what you contributed, does live on past your own life.
Well, it's good of you to be sappy, because it is a sense of pleasure, certainly, that there's something there, something tangible left behind. You realize that your books then become history. They're not read as they are when they're published. They have some sort of interest, which is not one that you immediately intended, but it is there. And that, of course, has got to be a sense of some gratification. Not that you love your books, at least I don't. When I look at them, a line of them, people sometimes say, "Oh, you must be very pleased by all this lot." I think, well, I'm not so sure. This one was overwritten, and that one's too long, and that one's got a misprints, and so on. There's nothing that makes you deeply, at least with me, deeply satisfied with any of my books, really. One sees I can't bear to read them again, actually. So the next one's going to be better.
It must be a great feeling, though, that many of your books will enter the historical record as a snapshot of a place in time that will never be that way again.
Yes, that is so. And the books I've written have been about places in quite quick transition. Obviously the Middle East, but Russia too, and China. When I first went to China, which is not so long ago, in the 90s, and there wasn't a single private car in China. It was just bicycles everywhere. And now, it's jam-packed. And that alone, as perfectly, perhaps trivial example of how things have changed in China, is perfectly extraordinary. And you realize very quickly that your books are out of date. They're no longer about a place that exists.
But at that precise moment, they become a place that did exist, and therefore even maybe more intriguing to some respect. If we're in constant change and you're just writing for the documentation of that exact change, it is forgotten. If it's You remarked about the loss of your mother. You wrote a book, Mount to Tibet, in 2011 after that. Do you think travel helps with with grief and sadness, or is it rather just a welcome distraction from it, but it doesn't do much to actually heal it?
It varies with every person. You know, I have friends, particularly one at the moment, the travel writer Rory McLean, trying to get over the death of his wife literally by travel experience of different places which would be relevant to faith and the afterlife. It hasn't, I mean, of course it can be a distraction, but I don't know that it is greatly healing. My journey to Mount Kailash in Tibet, I think it was because I think I wanted to put a sort of a kind of stop to the life I was immediately living, which was a life in London, probably preparing for another book, I can't remember, but it didn't seem right to continue the ordinary life that I was living after the death of somebody I loved. So going on a sort of secular pilgrimage, if you like, to a mountain in Tibet, which was sacred to Buddhists, to Hindus, to Jain people, but was above all a sort of sacred object in the landscape, if you like. And you could experience it and circle it, which is how people reverence it. It's never been climbed, that mountain. That was, I think, simply a way of telling myself, this is something that marks a change in one's life, physically on the ground, in my work, and so on. And so the writing of the book was not exactly an experience of healing, but some attempt at it anyway. And it's the only time I've done that.
Something I noticed in doing all the research for you was that you don't have any children. You are married. Was kids ever something you wanted, or was the necessary trade-off of you going on these long journeys and doing all this sort of very isolated writing at too much of a cost to also at the same time be a good father?
Well, it could have been. As somebody said, I think Cyril Connolly, the great enemy of creativity is the pram in the hall. I think it was unplanned in my case. I think I could easily have been married and had children in my face, but I was much in love with somebody who didn't want to marry, or not marry me anyway. And thereafter, it's often circumstance, you know. I met my wife late, and so we had the fortune of a grandson by our first marriage, which is my real experience of a child, which is lovely. But I don't know whether I'd been a good father. I was very obsessed by my work. I didn't plan not to have children. It just didn't happen. And I didn't, as I think some men do, want them to the degree of marrying for them and wanting a family life. I never really wanted children particularly. They didn't mean much to me. It was the woman that was important to me, always the wife, rather than the son or daughter. So it was partly just luck or ill luck, you might say, that this happened. Not really planned, simply how things evolved for me.
Not a conscious trade-off that even though I want to do this, it's not worth it. Okay. Well, thank you for...
It certainly would have been very difficult given my profession. Also, honestly, on a financial level, you don't make a great deal as a writer, even a moderately successful one as I've been, and you want to educate your children well. And I think I would have been much more grounded had I been married and had children. I'd have been writing different sorts of books and probably doing a lot of journalistic work, or work that was going to bring in more obvious rewards financially.
Well, thanks for answering that, Colin. I'm just conscious of it potentially being a little bit too nosy and none of my business, but I do appreciate you answering it. So you were 81 when you did the Amur River. You just talked about you always need to have another project. What's the place in the world that most calls to you at the moment?
Well, I'm writing a novel at the moment. I've always written novels between the travel books, little read compared to the travel books. But after that, it's quite hard at my age, which is now 85, to persuade a publisher that you've got any future. But I'd like to go back to China. I'd like to do something on what you might call the other China, the China of the holy mountains and the monasteries, which still flourish there, or maybe not flourish, but they're still very much intact. And I'd like, there are these sites in China of a pilgrimage, which are immensely interesting to me, and the whole tradition of Chinese spirituality, which is Buddhist, and Taoist, which is a sort of quietistic religion, you could say, interests me a lot. And it's now wiped off the picture. I mean, people just don't talk about it. And we're so obsessed by China as a political entity and possible threat. And this part of China, whether important politically or not, I don't know. But it's immensely interesting for its own sake and would make for beautiful journeying, because so much of particularly the inland of China, the mountain areas are populated have monasteries and are sites of the old landscape painters who had a sort of religious feeling about them.
You've come and gone through China so many times, and China, the political entity today, is probably the most powerful surveillance state on the planet. Are you aware of ever being on any lists or being flagged as someone who is a troublemaker? Is there any sort of threat of you not even being let back into the country? Has any of this ever cropped up?
I doubt if I'm considered a high risk, because the books are there and they couldn't be considered very great threats to the regime. I think there have been one or two passages in books which I've thought might be taken as extremely hostile and would be anathema. But odd enough, my last book on the Amur River was published in China, and the previous one on the Silk Road was published in China, and nobody seemed to be troubled by it. I checked a bit as to whether some parts had been excised, and they hadn't been. What my fear would be, not that I'd be banned from the country, that I would be given somebody for my protection, as it were, and basically given a minder. And that would kill my sort of writing. I mean, the moment you're with somebody who's sort of translating, or it puts off those people you're talking to, they assume they're government, I'm sure, and they become inhibited in talking. And so that would kill the book I'm writing, and that would be my worry, not the other.
It turns the mirror with which you want to reflect the country into just a blackboard.
Yeah.
Forgive that attempt at literary observation. What's the Chinese market like? Are they ravenous? Are they reading lots of books?
Yes, I think they read a lot. A friend of mine who wrote a book on the Great Game, as they called it, the British and Russian confrontations in Afghanistan and other places. His book was, this was a long time ago, published in China, but he didn't get any royalties or anything for it in those days. They just took it and pirated it and published it. And he said, I would like to know how many they printed. And in those days, I don't know whether it still happens, the print number is actually written inside the book. It's hard to dare tell him how much royalties it was missing, because it said something like, 120,000 copies published, which was phenomenal. And I can't remember how many, maybe more even. So, well, it's quite a market. I don't know about the Chinese publishing market now. I can't even guess. But I was interested that they were keen to, both the Russians and the Chinese, publish my Amur River book. Chinese paid handsome royalties in perfectly good order and responsibly. The Russians published it, and I don't know whether I've received anything. It's all a mess. But that's since the Ukraine war.
Yeah, of course. Just a few more for you, Colin. You've been so generous with your time. How does it feel to have the likes of Rory Stewart appraise you as an influence?
Well, he's a very bright guy. I'm very happy that he should. I didn't know he had, actually.
Oh, yes.
Well, anyway, no, he is an interesting man, because he came to me when he was very young and said, I hadn't ever met him before. He said, I'd like to meet you because you experienced parts of the world I'm interested in, and I have an idea for walking across the world, going across by foot. And he came to me and I thought, what a strange idea. And he seemed quite fragile and very young, in his 20s, and completely unknown. And so we looked at maps, and I said, whatever you do, don't walk through Afghanistan. And that's what he did, and made his name with it.
Yeah.
So he may feel an affection for me, but no, I'm quite happy for him to applaud me. He's an unusual man, and I wish there were more in politics with his intelligence. Don't have many of those.
Absolutely.
In England, anyway.
After the biggest self-inflicted wound being Brexit, the second must be choosing Boris Johnson over Rory Stewart for leader of the Tories. Yeah. No, his book...
Disaster.
His book, In Between the Places, I think it might be my favorite ever travel book. It could just be recency bias why I'm saying that. But there's this forcefulness to the way that he approaches each village night after night to find a place to sleep. them saying, "Who are you? You're a spy." And he goes, "No, are you not a good Muslim? Will you not give me hospitality? Your enemy just over the hill gave me hospitality last night. Are you not a good Muslim?" And he's obviously doing this in whatever the local language is. And it's just, yeah, it's a very powerful book. It's very inspiring for someone like me, and I'm sure for hundreds of thousands of other people as well that read it.
It's a lovely book.
Yeah.
And what a bold thing to do.
Totally. You gave this lovely answer once in an interview that certain authors swamp you and you will subconsciously end up imitating them when you're writing. I just wonder whether you have a list of authors that have swamped you most and probably most subconsciously imitated your writing.
I think in my case of childhood influences, it was nothing to do with travel writing. It would be poetry. I read an awful lot of poetry as a kid. And I think the sort of rhythms and cadences of English poetry almost entirely leaked into me from a very early period. And that's probably a more primary influence than anything that came later. After that, as I've mentioned, Freya Stark had an influence. The sort of lucid kind of poetry of her writing was very attractive to me. And the other was Patrick Leigh Fermor, that robust kind of sensibility, a very elaborate, a very dangerous influence to have because he's a very Baroque writer and he gets away with it himself, but few other writers can get away with writing like that. But these influences, of course, when you're very young, and then they do become a sort of part of you in a way and are no longer a sort of conscious influence or anything you would consciously copy, but they're sort of there in your makeup.
You're kind of in a rare position having published so many nonfiction and fiction books. Do you find writing fiction much harder than nonfiction?
Harder in a different way, that's all. With nonfiction, you've got material that a journey that happened and you write about it as well as you can. The problem is very often in the journey itself rather than the writing of it, whether you can get the right material, talk to interesting people, all such things are a challenge you don't have in a novel. But what you have with the travel book, of course, is a framework. Something happened. You've got a chronology, a beginning and an end. With a novel, you begin with nothing. There's nothing to hang on to. You don't know where it comes from. You don't know why you're writing it. Some people fall in love with the plot. Some people fall in love with the character. I don't do either. I fall in love with, I don't even know what to call it. It's not even an idea. I just wander about, let things wash in and out of my head, and one or two things sort of stick in a way as if it's a net. And these are the things that eventually evolve into a novel. And you've got everything has to come from your own imagination. And that I probably think novels are harder because I'm writing one at the moment. If you ask me that and I'm writing a travel book in a year or two, I'll say travel books are harder. But I think the difficulties are just very different.
Serendipity. I wrote to you about this before we started, but I've asked this to every guest who's come on the podcast, some variation of the question for what has the role that serendipity has been in your life? And I think particularly for you, I'd like to ask, how has serendipity also determined the direction of your work?
Yes, I don't know whether it determined the direction, but it's permeated the practice. Without serendipity, without those you meet in travel, my books would lose a lot of their sort of pivotal moments and the moments that are memorable, the moments that are revealing. And the people I meet are often by chance, absolute pure serendipity. They come because you don't plan them. You're probably traveling in a rather remote place. You can't set up contacts or ask people back in the UK who you should meet because nobody knows anyone there. And so you're absolutely reliant on who you happen to meet. And so serendipity is built into the process. Without it, there'd be no book. So it's absolutely fundamental to my way of writing.
Is there any particular moment of serendipity that pops to the top of your mind that was so material in the quality and the outcome of your work that comes to mind?
No individual moment, I don't think, that altered the course of the travel writing or the way I wrote or thought about things. There are certain moments where you feel that something supplied a bit of material for you that was crucial to your book and that you'd always wanted, and just by chance it fell into your lap. For instance, in the book on Siberia, really, I was at the very end of the book and in the area called Kolyma, which was famous as the site of Stalin's worst gulags, and I wanted to see one. And they sort of there were villages or something. They kind of disintegrated. And I still wanted that experience of personally seeing one of these awful places. And I just about given up the idea. And I fell in by chance with a young architect who said, let's go on a journey. I can take you up a strange valley. And he took me up in his Land Rover. It was wonderful, heavy snow. And we blundered through eventually, very beautiful, and eventually arrived at a completely derelict Gulag camp, still intact after, well, it must have been abandoned in the Khrushchev period, probably in the mid-50s. And here it was, 60, 70 years later, waiting for me.
Wow.
And that seemed like pure serendipity. I mean, even the guards' boots were lying about, and the bunks where they had, and the prison and so on. It was all there in ruin, but had been offered me by pure luck, by that experience. Other times, I guess, you're just glad that you've been sort of rescued from a situation which you really couldn't see the way out of. I mean, I had that in the Amur River after having problems in Mongolia, horse riding through the sources of the Amur River through swamps for many days, and the horse fell and rolled on top. Anyway, I emerged from this experience with a broken ankle and 2 broken ribs and didn't know how I was going to pursue the next part of the river, which was winding through difficult territory, how I'd ever be able to do it. And yet I felt I had to. And then by pure chance, I fall in love, practically. But there were 2 Russian guys who were terrific. One was a Buddhist monk and the other was a sort of entrepreneur, and they were all buddies. They'd got together, they had a car, and they decided that my project was more exciting than theirs. They took me around, really following the river, the next part of the river as close as it could be, while I nursed my broken body. And that was pure luck. Otherwise, I don't know I might have just had to fly home in that condition. But those sort of things have been blessed bits of serendipity, which has saved me. There have been others.
They're wonderful anecdotes, Colin. Thank you so much. Last question for you, mate. Is there if you think about bullishness, something you're really optimistic for, what is a country around the world that you're particularly bullish on?
Oh dear, that's hard. In the state that we're all in nowadays, if somebody else had asked me that, I'd have probably said Australia or New Zealand, but you'll laugh at me. So many countries seem in such a parlous state, including my own, that it's a very, very hard to answer. There are countries I applaud, I must say, like Canada very recently, and Poland, which has come back from the brink of autocracy and is standing firm with its democratic traditions in place. And Poland's been admirable. I can't say that any country makes me feel a terrific surge of optimism as we are now, but we'll see.
We'll see. Colin Thubron, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. It really means a lot to me. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm delighted. Thank you very much. You're very sensitive interviewing.